Hello, and thank you for your interest in my presentation today, and more specifically to the organizers who made it possible for me to be able to present to you from here in Richmond Hill, Ontario in Canada. Just a brief introduction, my name is Adriana Pisano Beaumont, and the research that I'm presenting today was completed in partnership with my research partner, Janice Hanna, who is the Senior Education and Research Specialist and Manager of International Fund for Animal Welfare's Northern Dogs Project. And this was done in conjunction with 5 First Nations, Cree, and Anishinaabe partner communities in Ontario and in Quebec. We can begin by stating that relationships between dogs and Indigenous peoples have been a central feature in First Nations and Inuit communities for millennia. And those relationships were centered on hunting, transportation, protection, and companionship. But before we can discuss the research today, we do need to create a context for colonialism in Canada. Everything we look at today is against a backdrop of a history of exploitative relationships with Indigenous peoples, and that included a lack of transparency and deception and disempowerment. Historically, unfortunately, many research relationships have also been exploitative and have lacked reciprocity, and as a result, it's created a sense of mistrust and skepticism. So before we can work in conjunction and partnership with the First Nations communities, we need to reflect on our own biases and develop research methods and service protocols that are respectful, collaborative, transparent, and empowering. When we approach health and welfare in First Nations communities, we need to bear in mind that First Nations communities hold a holistic worldview. Living in a good way, or Minobima Dizuin, is an integrative goal of growth and healing by all relations and all life entities in a more than human world. This means that when we construct our model of community, we have to consider the welfare of all individuals within it from the perspective of the Indigenous population within the community. This requires that we address dog welfare alongside human welfare in order to improve community wellness. So we should talk about the dogs. They're such an important part of this research project. As groups were moved on to reserves and into encampments, and that was forced relocation, the relationships between humans and dogs in these communities moved away from the traditional hunting and trapping. Uncontrolled reproduction over time has led to more free-roaming dogs, and especially in remote communities that lack access to veterinary care. So along with this comes the increased risks of bites, zoonotic diseases, pack aggressions, and unfortunately this has led some communities to shoot dogs to control population during surges. We also see a change in the breeds of dogs. We still see many husky crosses, but now we're starting to see small toy and single coat breeds as well, which is a problem because the winters are extremely harsh in some of these northern communities. And single-coated breeds, as well as small breeds and puppies, do very poorly in those conditions. The dogs, much like their people, are finding themselves caught between traditional ways and modern life. So with regards to the project itself, only communities who voiced an interest in participating were actually included. We received IRB ethics approval from Canisius College's ethics department, and we wanted to have additional ethical guidelines that specifically related to Indigenous research. So we consulted the Tri-Council policy statement, specifically Chapter 9, that has guidelines for respectful and collaborative research relationships with Indigenous peoples. We also consulted OCAP, which is Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession, and it relates to the stewardship of information or data that's gathered and how that information is managed in a way that benefits the community while minimizing harm. We also appealed to community-based participatory research as a framework, and that was what outlined the collaborative partnership with the communities that was the underpinnings of the research itself. For our research, we used community-based participatory methods, and this had an emphasis on relationship building with the communities involved. It provides an alternative to conventional research approaches that tend to separate a phenomenon from its context. In terms of the methodology, it enlists those most affected by the issues to work as active and equal research partners throughout. The diagram on the left shows the 4 pillars: consultation, engagement, collaboration, and communication. And this is a circle because it's an ongoing process. We use semi-structured interviews to allow for storytelling, which is a culturally relevant way of communicating knowledge for Indigenous communities. It also illuminates nuances that are otherwise lost in simple questionnaires or Likert scales, for example. Indigenous methodology also requires that there be an action component to any research that is undertaken, and that employs sharing results with partner communities and also an effort to facilitate and assist communities in achieving their ultimate goals. So the question is, what did we learn? We had in our participants 26 males and 27 females, which yielded a total of 53 conversations that were transcribed and then analyzed for thematic content. And this is across 5 communities. We also collected some demographic information by means of a questionnaire, as well as obviously the thematic analysis of the semi-structured interviews. 94% is what we found had owned a dog in the past. 64% are identified as current dog owners, and 62% view their own dogs as a family member or as a companion or friend. Through thematic analysis using in vivo, we saw that certain narrative themes emerged from the semi-structured interviews. These were not predetermined, but they emerged organically from the data. And each of the themes also most of them had sub-themes. And some of the sub-themes had valences, meaning that for each reference, the reference could have been a positive reference or perhaps a negative reference to the same sub-theme. The most prevalent main theme that we found was attachment. Out of a possible 3,573 references, there were 842 references to attachment, and those were across 53 sources or 53 communities. So everybody made at least one reference to attachment. Also, dog health and welfare. 53 communities, 627 references. That means that everybody spoke about dog health and welfare in some form. When we designed this research, we specifically chose community A, B, C, D, and E because they aligned themselves along a continuum of strategies for dog population management, which is outlined here in the bottom right-hand side of this slide. To the left are the less humane methods, things like shooting dogs, full-time tethering, and to the right are more what we consider to be more humane alternatives, responsible pet ownership bylaws, humane education, and so on. Community A aligns itself a little bit more towards the left of this spectrum, and community E is more towards the right of the spectrum, and B, C, and D align in that order between those two. What we found sort of interesting is that community profiles emerged. Each community, when you look more carefully at a specific theme, talks about it in a very different way than other communities. So Indigenous communities are not a monolith. They are diverse, and the data bears that out even in the way that they talk about their relationships with dogs. Another thing that we found sort of interesting is when we look at community A and compare to community E, we see that the working, hunting, trapping discussions and references to this kind of relationship are much more prevalent in community A than in community E. Whereas community A talked a lot less or made fewer references to friendship and companionship with relation to the dogs, as did community E. And in fact, we see almost a downward trend from community A through E in the discussions around working, hunting, and trapping relationships, and an increase in discussions from community A through community E in discussions about companionship and friendship. And we can build on that further. When we look at specific references to, for example, tethering sentiments may be positive or negative. Some people may think tethering is wonderful, and other people may think tethering is very cruel. And when we looked at that more closely, looking at the context of the reference, we were able to create this profile across communities of how people felt about tethering. And for example, community A, which again, as a reminder, sits at the left side of this continuum, 81% of the references to tethering were positive in sentiment. Whereas when we look at community E, 75% were negative. So this again reflects back on where people, where communities are with regards to their own strategies. So I thought that was a kind of an interesting insight. So across communities, overwhelmingly, the most referenced subtheme when speaking about dog health and welfare as the main theme was neglect, cruelty, and indifference. But we also found that females and puppies were also frequently referenced. And we decided to look more specifically at whether there were any gender differences in how male participants and female participants discussed dog health and welfare. And what we found was that female participants talked about the females and puppies more than twice as often, or more than twice as many references as did males. And we thought that was kind of an interesting observation. Again, sort of warning us that you can't generalize across genders even, much less across communities. What we also found when we looked more closely at gender was that males and females learned how to care for dogs from different sources. Males identified grandparents predominantly as their main source of information about how to care for dogs, while females identified parents. And notable was the fact that grandparents were actually absent as a source of knowledge for all of the females that were interviewed with regards to where they got their knowledge for how to care for dogs. Children and dogs was another important theme that we felt was worth exploring in a little bit more detail. In order to do that, we needed to look at each individual reference and assign it a valence of either a positive or negative sentiment, much like we did with tethering. Interestingly, community A and B, most of the references to children and dogs were negative in sentiment, whereas community E, most of the references were positive. And when we look at where these communities lie, again, remember we created this continuum of strategies for dog population management. Community A and B are towards the left on this continuum, meaning that they are still employing full-time tethering and dog shoots when necessary to control dog populations. Whereas community E is more towards the right on this continuum, meaning they already have a humane education program, they have a responsible pet ownership bylaw. So this is sort of an opportunity for more research. We can investigate this further and maybe look at why and whether there is a correlation. There's certainly a significant difference across communities that was borne out by this data, but what we don't know is it somehow related to the programming across the communities? On another note, we also looked at dog bites, the discussion about dog bites and aggression. And out of the total number of references, it was a pretty even split. Men and women participants were speaking about dog bites and aggression about equally. So out of the total number of references, half were male, 47.7%, and approximately half were female. When we look at the discussion about fear of dogs, in other words, references to fear of dogs, 80.6% of those references come from female participants. In other words, females seem to be expressing more fear of dogs in the discussions. And that also is an interesting, maybe future area of research. So ultimately, if the desire is to enter into a research relationship or a service relationship to help with dog population management strategies in these communities, cultural competence is paramount. We need to embrace and include Indigenous methodologies if we're carrying out research, and that should include participatory and collaborative relationships with the communities at all stages of research, from its inception to data collection, to sharing back with the communities what the results are, and then looking for using that information to look for meaningful solutions and to facilitate them if we're asked to. We found that attachment definitely exists between people in these communities and their dogs. People love their dogs, and most think of them as family. There are genuine concerns for dog and human welfare, and there is also a lot of diversity between communities, and the data bears that out, that we can't view First Nations communities as a monolith. Each community is very different, and even just in this one sort of area of research, we've seen not only differences in attitudes towards certain themes, attachment, for example, but also within across genders, across age groups. So we need to approach the research in that spirit. And these are just my references if anybody's interested. Lastly, I'd just like to say thank you all for taking the time to listen to my presentation. I hope that you found something meaningful in it, and I hope that we're able to make arrangements the day of for some question and answers. I'll try and see if I'm able to Skype in and answer any questions that anybody has. Thank you very much for your patience and for your kindness in participating in this presentation. Thank you.